Welcome to Quilter's Architect. My name is Mark. In this video, I'm going to continue my work on the My 9 Live sampler quilt pattern. You can go to the description of this video. You can download a document that's the overall quilt pattern. And then for each block that I'm doing, I also have a link in the corresponding video to the document that's specific to that sampler block. So I invite you to download that block and follow along with me. In today's video, I'm continuing my work on block 3. This block is named Mountains. And if you take a look here at the pattern, this is a simple block with 2 flying geese, and it's using 3 different fabrics from the quilt pattern. So you might be wondering, as I've presented this series, I've been sharing a near-death experience related to the block. I'm trying to relate them to the blocks. Again, these are not in chronological order. Rather, I've organized the blocks, the sampler blocks in the quilt, and when these events occurred more corresponds to which block I'm talking about in a specific video. Today, we have to go back to when I was around 19, and I was working for a company named Irby, and they came in and put in transmission line power line towers, and these are those steel towers that are 100 to a couple hundred feet tall. You've probably seen these power lines in your area. These are the biggest ones that they put in. Typically when the power line's being put in, there's a right-of-way, and they cut that right-of-way through the area where they're going to put that power line. We as a crew would drive to a specific site of a power line tower, and we would go up and work on that tower. We were linemen. Well, we all rode out there on a truck, and these trucks were big. Imagine the cab of the truck looked like the size of the cab of a semi-truck. Immediately behind the cab was a crew box. Inside that crew box, 8 guys could ride out to the job site. So you had 2 or 3 guys up front in the cab, and then around 8 guys or less in that crew box. Behind the crew box in the truck was a big long bed, like a metal bed, a flat bed with some rails on the side and the back. And we could carry along various tools or things we needed for the job that day. I had never driven one of these trucks. It just so happens that one day we were out on the mountain. We were down in the Pineville area of Kentucky, and this is a mountainous area. It has a famous mountain called Pine Mountain. If you've ever been there, it's a really pretty mountain that you can visit. It's like a park. But the mountains all around that area were similar. They're pretty large mountains. These mountains were the type of mountains where there were even some places where there were cutbacks. If you've never heard of cutbacks, you're trying to drive up a mountain. These are not roads like you drive up in your car normally. These are a little rougher roads, like the loggers would use them, or construction companies, or fire units are trying to put out a fire. But the way the cutbacks work is you drive up that mountain and you're going one direction, then the road switches directions, but it's an immediate, you have to pull up forward and back up the other level. And then when you get to the next cutback, you have to drive up the next one. So these places we were going to work were on steep mountainsides. And one day, my supervisor, who was my brother-in-law, he was running with a crane, and they called them wood tigers. The reason they called them a wood tiger is because these cranes were running on bulldozer tracks. You could take this crane just about anywhere on those bulldozer tracks, and then you could raise portions of a power line tower up as you were building sections of a power line tower. So at this point in time, we were doing assembly work. We weren't doing the lineman work. Well, my brother-in-law had used that crane almost all day. He had, been hoisting different sections together. And at the end of the day, we always did it. Everybody did it. He was reeling in the ball. There's like a large steel ball with a big hook on the end of that cable. And at the end of the day, you'd reel that thing in, and you'd put the boom down, and you'd leave the wood tiger or crane on the mountain at the job site. He had the boom still up in the air. The boom of the crane was up probably, on this type of angle, 45-degree angle. It wasn't extended fully, but just the boom itself was probably 20, maybe 15 to 20 feet, somewhere in there. And he was standing there and he was watching the workers, and they, he was reeling in. He just had his hand on the lever reeling in that boom. What he didn't know is that there's a ring at the end of the boom. That cable's running through that ring, and that ring is what keeps that ball and hook from coming over the end of the boom and falling back on the operator of the crane. So what my brother-in-law Ron didn't know is that was damaged. Evidently, I don't know if it happened during that day or when it happened, or if it was due to just wear and tear, but that ring had cracked, and it was no longer a secure way to prevent that huge steel ball and hook from coming over the top of the crane as you're reeling it in. So he's reeling in the crane, and that's exactly what happens. That retainer ring is supposed to keep it from coming over the end broke, and that steel ball with that large hook that you pick up large pieces of steel with, it came down and he wasn't looking. He's watching some workers. He's thinking he's reeling this in, and usually it stops when it gets to the top, and you hear it stop. Well, this thing comes down and it hits his arm. It's a good thing it didn't hit him anywhere else, right? Because these things are really heavy. Could have injured him seriously, but it just grazed his arm. It just so happened, but it was enough that we called into the main office. There's a work yard typically when these construction crews are working somewhere, and it's centrally located to where they're working at that time. And so we called down there to the office, and they said, no, we've got to, if that's what happened, we'll send out someone to take him into the hospital, because they wanted him to be looked at medically right away. They didn't want him to just ride back with the crew and then go. So they come and get my brother-in-law. Well, he's the truck driver. I was kind of on this crew, even though I was young. I was 19 years old. Because it was my brother-in-law, he had always, I guess, delegated stuff to me, and the people on the crew, even though they were all older than me, looked at me as his right-hand guy. I don't know if it was positive or negative, but they thought I was his assistant. So we're all there, and he's gone. The guy who came to pick him up didn't bring anybody else, and it's time to go home. And here we are, all of us kind of looking at each other well, who's going to drive? And none of them wanted to drive, and they're all looking at me well, you're the right-hand guy, you drive. As I climbed up in this truck, I was thinking, I'm really going to drive this massive truck? I'd never driven anything bigger than a pickup truck. At one point later in my life, I drove, some dump trucks with trailers in the back and things like that. But before this, I had never driven anything with a trailer or anything really big. So all the guys are getting ready to put their lunch boxes in the truck and climb into the crew cab. And one guy's going to ride up front with me. And one guy says, hey, there's a chalk under the wheel. You want me to kick it out? And because I didn't have any experience with these trucks, I was like, yeah, let's kick out the chalk. And he kicks out the chalk, and everybody gets in the truck. And so my background with any vehicle that was clutch, has a manual transmission with a clutch, is I had a 68 Camaro. And back in those days, there was no such thing as a safety switch in the ignition where you couldn't start the vehicle unless you had the clutch and the brake pressed, or something like that. If you'd had to have it in neutral and the brake held, there was nothing like that. All the time I'd had my 68 Camaro, the first thing I did when I started it is I just pushed the clutch in and put my foot on the brake, and I'd start my Camaro. I never had any trouble, right? Because the brakes worked when the engine was off. Well, interestingly, these trucks they sounded like air brakes. I'm not an expert on those trucks, but they always made there was always this air sound. Like when you're putting on the brake, and you would hear this air sound. And so I think they're air-based brakes, or there might be hydraulics involved, I'm not sure. But when the engine was off, you had zero brakes. Well, when I jumped up in this truck, everybody's in there, and I jump up in there, and I go to start it, and the first thing I do, which was so dumb, but I didn't know I didn't have any experience with this truck, is I pushed in the clutch, I took it out of gear, and I turned the ignition. Well, guess what? That truck would not start. And here we go down the hill, because once I took it out of gear, there was nothing to stop that truck from moving, and the brake didn't work. I'd put my foot on the brake pedal, but the brake wasn't working. And that's because these brakes are dependent on the engine running. And so we're going down this hill, and it's a mountain. This is not like a hill like in a hilly rolling hills area. This is a true mountain, and it goes down, and if you go down the mountain fast and you can't control the vehicle, you're going to go over the side. You're going to go over a cliff into a ravine. Here I am, the vehicle speeding up, and I see guys I see these igloo lunch boxes. They're like red and white and blue and white, those colors. I see these in the mirror. This truck has these huge long mirrors on both sides, and I see lunch boxes being thrown out of the truck. And I also see guys jumping, they're bailing out of the truck because they know it's not running, and we're in a free fall down the side of this mountain in this truck. And so what I'm doing this whole time is I'm trying the ignition, and it's not starting. And I'm trying the gears. I'm like, maybe I can jam this thing in a gear. Well, none of those things were working. And the guy beside me, he was probably 45 years old. I'm guessing 40 or 45 years old. Probably a seasoned guy who knew how to drive these trucks. he had stepped out on the gas tank. There's those gas tanks beside the door where you get in. And he was standing on that gas tank. He was ready to jump off, and he had his door open. And he's standing out here ready to go. And I think I was the last one in the truck. And he was still there. And he was like screaming at me, get it in gear and start the engine. Well, finally it started, but we were going pretty fast. I don't know how fast we were going. I wasn't looking at the speedometer. I was like panicking, trying to get this thing in gear or trying to get it started. When that thing started, the brakes started working, right? So we were able to get the truck stopped. My heart, I don't know how fast my heart was beating, but it felt like it was pounding out of my chest. And it was like a crazy experience because it's one of those things where you don't want to I guess a lot of people would have bailed out of the truck as the driver. But I guess in my mind, I was thinking, if I let this truck go over the hill and I don't try to stop this truck from going over the mountain, I'll lose my job for sure. Probably wasn't worth it. Maybe I should have bailed. I don't know. But anyways, that was my thought. That's why I was in the truck. I was trying to start it. I was trying to jam it in a gear as I was going down the hill. If I had went down over that hill, there's no way. I don't see any way how a person could have survived. You would have been mangled or crushed because there was a ravine, and you can imagine this huge, heavy truck going head over heels, spinning and crashing in the bottom of a ravine. So that definitely was a near-death experience. And I definitely learned something from that if you're going to drive any vehicle, especially vehicles you're not familiar with, you better think twice about it, right? If you don't understand the vehicle, and I didn't understand the vehicle, I didn't understand the brakes. I had ridden in it every day for months, but I never drove the truck, so I didn't really understand how the brakes work. So if you don't understand the vehicle, probably better not to drive it. But it was also kind of sad that those guys who were with me who knew how to drive the truck, none of them offered to drive the truck. Well, interestingly, so on the other side of the mountain, in the valley, there's a valley between us and the next mountain. Well, on the next mountain is another work crew. These guys are over there and they're watching this whole thing unfold. And they tell us later, they're just like falling down on the ground laughing as they watch this truck going down the hill and guys bailing out on both sides and lunch pails being thrown out. And so they got back to the work site before us. They had already told the foreman, and he was already ready for me. He was going to rip me down one side and up the other. And then the guy off our crew, who already didn't like the fact that I was the supervisor's brother-in-law on the crew that we're on, he ran into the office and he got that foreman, and he basically unloaded everything. I don't know what he said, but he basically went in and gave the report of the mistake I had made, and what everybody almost died, I guess, or they had to jump out of the truck. And so that guy took me in there, and I don't know how long I was in there, for like 10 or 15 minutes. He's just chewing me out, cursing me. And after that, every time he saw me, he didn't fire me. He started calling me truck driver. And he told me like the next day or two, after I guess he cooled down, and he says, what's going to happen? He says, you're going to start driving the truck, and Ron's going to teach you how to drive this truck. And so after that, for like, I don't know how many days, there I was driving this truck out, to the job site and driving it back, which was an experience too, this time I was told various things about the truck and how to operate it. And on top of that, they had me start running the wood tagger, which is a crane on a bulldozer. So here I was driving these big trucks up the mountain, down the mountain, and also this bulldozer type of crane. So that was an exciting experience, and one I'll never forget. I know there's still a lot of these construction companies that use these big trucks, and I could see this happening to a lot of people. You don't really know how that brake system works on that truck, and you jump in there thinking you can drive it like any other manual transmission vehicle. But it's not true. You have to know those brakes and what your limits are. And my biggest mistake was taking that chalk out. When those guys asked me, you want us to kick the chalk out of the wheel? That was a huge mistake. But after it was done, there was no going back because gravity kicked in. So that's my reason I chose a mountains block for the sampler quilt, to go with my experience of almost going over the mountain in a truck. Okay, so I've went ahead and cut and ironed the fabric, and I have it here, the pieces laid out. And it's fairly simple, right, because we have 2 flying geese. So I have the 2 smaller blocks with the lighter color, and then I have the 2 medium fabrics. And all I'm going to do is make 2 flying geese. So we can see this is a fairly straightforward block. In the quilt pattern on page 2, we can see the actual size for the pieces we need to cut. If you look at page 3, it gives us the instructions for making the block, and it mentions right away at the top that we can look at Appendix FG2 for detailed instructions for making single flying geese. Here you can see on the instructions for the single flying geese that we draw a center line from corner to corner on our pieces of fabric, which I've already done. And then we put the right sides together, right? We're going to take one of those squares, we're going to lay it on the rectangle, and then we're going to, it tells us to, we can pin them if we like, and then we sew directly on this line. And then what we'll do is we'll cut our fabric off 1/4 inch to the outside corner, and we'll be able to press our smaller square open to create our flying geese. So I'm going to go ahead and start putting this together. And again, it's always good when we're doing flying geese to remember that we want to orient our line in the same direction, like to create a point, right? Because we're trying to end up with that lighter fabric on the corners after we sew and do our cutting. When we sew the square to the rectangle on these single flying geese, it often seems like that the rectangle can end up slightly small. We can sew this stitch just slightly on the outside edge of that line. So it's kind of like a thread width or stitch width to the other side of that line. And that way, when we finish our flying geese rectangle, the dimension of the fabric is taken up by the seam itself and the fabric being folded. We gain a little bit more by putting that stitch over just a little bit to one side of that line, to the outer corner. Everybody has their own way to do these, but it seems like that's been helping me a little bit. And so once we have our square joined to the rectangle, we're going to put our ruler here where the 1/4 inch line from the edge of our ruler is on that seam we just made. And then we'll just cut this outside portion off. And then we'll just press these open. So once we get our first square joined to the rectangle, then we just do our second one for both pieces. And again, paying attention to the orientation of our drawn line so that it's properly oriented and not put on the wrong way. Now sometimes after we press these open to the corner, we end up seeing these dog ears here. They'll be very minor usually when we're using the single flying geese instructions, but that's something we can trim off if we like. And we can just put our ruler corner to corner. We still want our 1/4 inch beyond that point, right? So we don't want to cut off an extra that we don't have to cut off. It's just a little raveling or dog ear. If we look at the quilt pattern, we see that the darker mountain in this case is on the top. That could be a personal choice. So now what we do is just join our 2 flying geese and we'll have our block completed. And then we just have our one last seam to press open. Before I attempt to square this block, I'm going to starch it. Okay, just squaring the block to finish up. Okay, so here is our mountains block with the 2 flying geese. So that finishes up our 3rd block in the sampler. I hope you're enjoying this sew along. I hope you'll join me in making the My 9 Lives quilt. In the next video, I'll continue on with block number 4, and I'll share another experience from my past where I had a close call with death. So I hope you're enjoying this series. If you enjoy videos like these with sew-alongs and receiving free quilt patterns, and you haven't already done so, please subscribe to my channel. Also, it helps if you can give a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, and if you have any comments you feel would help myself or others, feedback for improvement, things you'd like to see in the videos, or tips and tricks you've learned, that would be great to see those in the comments. In the meantime, I'm wishing you happy sewing and beautiful finishes.